Good afternoon to our viewers in the United States and good evening to those watching us from Europe. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jörn Fleck and I'm the Acting Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion, Can Zeitenwende Deliver? A conversation about Germany's foreign and defense policy shifts in light of Russia's war in Ukraine. Today we mark 263 days since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On February 24th, the start of Putin's war against the people of Ukraine sent shockwaves through Europe and sparked a reckoning in Berlin. Just days after the invasion, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz delivered his now famous Zeitenwende speech. Chancellor Scholz acknowledged, "We have entered a new era," promised a turning point in Germany's foreign security and defense policies, and rocketed the term Zeitenwende into the regular vocabulary of the foreign policy communities from DC to Berlin. To many, especially in Europe, this speech came as a surprise, breaking with long-held principles and posture of German foreign policy. Germany broke precedent by delivering lethal military aid to Ukraine. Longtime Germany watchers were stunned to hear big-ticket announcements like the €100 billion special fund for defense spending, the purchase of US F-35s, and a recommitment to nuclear sharing. To others, especially among Berlin's allies, Germany's Zeitenwende was a long overdue recognition of decades of failed German policy, especially towards Russia. Even as Ukrainian soldiers made decisive gains to retake Kherson last week, the debate continues from Kyiv to Berlin to Washington, D.C. about whether Germany is doing enough to support Ukraine. And many more are still waiting to see this Zeitenwende move from rhetoric to reality. As we unpack this debate of whether and how Zeitenwende can deliver, one thing is clear. Germany's transformation will require more than speeches and a turning point on defense spending alone. It will require a fundamental shift in how policymakers in Berlin and Germans from Bonn to Dresden think about Germany's geopolitical role and responsibilities. And so we're delighted to welcome Lars Klingbeil, Chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, as our special guest for today's discussion. Chairman Klingbeil has spoken openly about identifying and naming mistakes and misperceptions of German policy, including in his own party. He's been a leading figure in the debate in Germany on drawing the right lessons from past failures and reshaping the country's relationship with Russia and the country's role in Europe and the world. Chairman Klingbeil, we look forward to hearing from you about how Germany's Zeitenwende can deliver. Following your remarks, our senior fellow Rachel Rizzo will moderate a discussion with you and our expert panelists. Chairman Klingbeil, over to you.
The Atlantic Council and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for having me here and for the possibility to have some short remarks and then the debate about the Zeitenwende and everything that is happening in Germany right now. So I'm here in these days in Washington for a political trip. I'm interested in what's happening after the midterms and what's happening here in the US politics. And as I recognized, in every corner here in Washington, there's a debate about the next presidential election campaign and what will happen. And this is an important point also for Germany, but my trip is also about the question how we could cooperate in the Transatlantic partnership and what does it mean for the field of security policy and how we could work together in this area. And this trip is also about the question of industry politics and the Inflation Reduction Act and what does it mean for industry politics in Europe and Germany. And this is also an area where we should focus that we not divide us in the area of industry politics and that we have a common interest in a good cooperation in this area. But I will focus in the short remarks a little bit on the question of Zeitenwende, the speech Olaf Scholz gave and what's the outcome of this speech. And you have to understand that in Germany, the start of the war in Ukraine is a big shift. This morning, someone told me it's a little bit like 9/11 for Germany, and I don't like to compare 9/11 with this moment. I lived in New York 9/11, and I've seen the tragedy of this moment and what it meant for US foreign policy. But if you see this moment when the war started in Ukraine, I really recognized that it was a huge historic shift in German foreign and security policy. And it was mentioned before, Olaf Scholz gave the speech in the German parliament. He talked about Zeitenwende, and one of the biggest shifts you can see in the moment is that we made this law in Germany, spending 100 billion for the German armed forces and giving this military funding, and that there also is a law that says we want to reach the 2% NATO aim in a permanent spending in the military. This is a huge shift we have in Germany today if you compare it to the last years. But there are also other shifts. For example, we are now the second biggest finance and military giver to the Ukraine. It was never a principle in Germany that we give weapons to countries where a conflict is in the moment. But now we shifted away from this principle, and after United States, we are the biggest military spender to Ukraine, and we also are very active in spending money to Ukraine, for example, for energy policy, for the question of healthcare, for the question of other very important topics and area in the Ukraine. And if it comes to reconstruction, Germany takes a very active role in the question of reconstruction, Ukraine, and rebuilding the country after war. And there's also one thing you have to see in the United States. There was 1 million of refugees coming from Ukraine to Germany, and we gave them secure home. We gave them stability, we gave them security. And if you look to the German situation, Poland was very active in the refugee question, but Germany was it also. So these are the short shifts we had in Germany, but there's also a debate going on about the German role. I gave a speech and said Germany has to become a leading power if there's a new security order, a new European security order. And I think this is a mind shift we need in Germany. That means more military spending, but also becoming a more active global player if it's about strategic cooperations, for example, with countries in Latin America and Asia and Africa. So there was too much place in the last years for Russia and for China, and they had good cooperations with these countries, and Germany, Europe has to play a much more bigger role. And you see this in these days when Olaf Scholz is active in G20, when he's active in the in Africa, when he's active in Asia with all his delegations, and he's trying to get these countries on our side. Third point is that we focusing also on the question of transatlantic partnership. And I think there's a very good cooperation between the Biden administration and the Scholz administration. And if I talk to people in my administration, they say it's a real responsible cooperation we have in both administrations. And now we have the question, what does it mean to build a much more better cooperation than it's today? So for me, for example, it's about industry policy, it's about Inflation Reduction Act, and maybe also on the question about trade policy and what could be the future of these questions. And I'm also here to learn what the American side is expecting from us. And one big topic we have to talk about is the question of China politics. So this is an area where we have to have a strategic transatlantic dialogue about the right politics towards China. Olaf Scholz was visiting China in the last week, and I heard today there was a good talk about Xi and Joe Biden. And I see that Scholz and Biden are pushing in the same direction. So they want China to be very clear on the nuclear questions. They want China to be very clear on this war in Ukraine and to leave the Russian side and put pressure on China about this question. But we also have to start a strategic dialogue about the future of China politics. And for me, it's very important that we do not do the same mistakes we did with Russia as Germany. So if you look to the debate and the situation we have now in Germany, we see that we had a big dependency on Russian gas. And this was a mistake, and we should not do this mistake again if we look to China. So that means we need a strategic dialogue now about independencies we have towards China. We need to be very clear in which areas China should be outside. For example, if we talk about digital infrastructure, if we talk about artificial intelligence, if we talk about data policy, we need to leave China. We need to let China outside. And then we need to see maybe on which resources we have dependencies towards China, and we have to reduce that so that we are prepared if there is a situation where China, for example, is attacking Taiwan, and then we need to handle and we need to act in another way than we did it with Russia today. So these are 3 points we have to talk about. We have to talk about the German situation, about the leading role Germany should play in Europe and for the future of security policy. And we need to talk about the transatlantic partnership. I think it's a very good partnership, but we have to be better in some areas, like I mentioned, China politics, trade politics, and this also includes the question of Inflation Reduction Acts. And I'm very happy to have this debate here at the Atlantic Council together with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And I'm very happy to have the debate and also listen to your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Klingbeil. Please go ahead and have a seat right here. Thank you for your comments. And before we get into questions and before we get into the panel, we have some audience in the room. We also have a large audience watching online. So if you have questions, if you'd like to contribute to the conversation, please be sure to use the Q&A function on Zoom. And if you're here in the audience, please raise your hand and someone will come along and give you an iPad and you can type your question there. So with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Klingbeil a couple of follow-up questions on your remarks. This has been a major 8 months in German foreign policy, and you've played a leading role in how Germany has messaged that foreign policy, not just to Germans, but to Europeans and to a larger global audience. You had a speech in October, which was translated into an op-ed for International Politic Quarterly, where you talk about basically the ways that Germany has gotten it wrong with regard to its relationship with Russia. You mentioned assuming historical connections between the two sides, which is something that Putin, you say, has never really believed in. You talk about the folly of change through rapprochement. And you say that Germany plays a leading role in creating a new peace order in Europe and in maintaining a rules-based order in a world in upheaval. That's a big role for Germany to play. Do you think it's ready to play that role?
I hope so, and we must be ready. I mean, we do not know what will happen in the United States with the next presidential election campaign, so that means Europe has to become much more stronger itself. We want the transatlantic link, but we have to become stronger ourselves, and that means, like I said before, we have to focus more on our own security. We have to focus more on the military question, but also on diplomatic questions, on economic questions, and we have to be ready for that. So there's no possibility maybe someday to say the Americans should do that. We have to do it ourselves.
Do you think that the German people are ready for Germany to play that role? Because it's one thing to sort of message the Zeitenwende to the policymaking class and to people who study foreign and security policy, but it's a lot different to make that mental shift for the voting public. How are you sort of going about that in this government? And do you think that term has taken hold within the German public at this point?
I think there is this mental shift in the moment, and the war in Ukraine is doing a lot for that. I mean, this is 2 hours away from Germany, there's a war, and this is changing so much in Germany in the moment. And if you look to the German situation right now, I mean, we have high energy prices, we have inflation, we have a critical domestic policy debate right now, but if you look to the polls, 2/3 of the people in Germany still say it's right to support the activities in Ukraine. So that means there's a mental shift in Germany, and I think Germany is ready to take more responsibility. But as you said before, it's also a mind shift for leaders and political debates. The one mistake of the Russian debate was that we did not prepare different scenarios. So we hope that they will not attack Ukraine, but we were not prepared if they do. And so if we talk about China right now, we don't hope that they will attack Taiwan, but we have to prepare if they do. And this is the responsibility political leaders have. And let me add one point more. You talked about the historical relationship we had with Russia. And I mean, to be honest, if we wouldn't have had them, there will be maybe no reunification of Germany. So it was always important for us to have this good relationship with Russia. But now we see in these days, Russia left the way. Russia left the common way, and to be honest, they did it 2008, maybe 2014, and we didn't recognize that. And that was the mistake, that we did not prepare the different scenarios, and we have to do that now for the future conflicts.
Absolutely. Liana and Dan, I wanted to turn to both of you to sort of expand upon these points a little bit. You mentioned that 2/3 of the German public still say it's right to support Ukraine. I think support for Ukraine in the United States is still high as well. Although a lot of people thought it was going to become a midterm issue, it actually didn't. And now we're heading into winter. We're coming up on a year in February. And it seems like the US-German relationship is really going to be a linchpin of continuing support for Ukraine. How do you see that playing out over the next few months? Liana, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think at the moment we're in a really good position, especially of the midterms, but I do see two challenges for the future. And the first challenge is that the German population does support the efforts for Ukraine, but it is more hesitant to assume a military leadership role. If you ask that in polls, should Germany assume a military leadership role, they are much more hesitant. And the other problem is the question of transatlantic burden sharing in the Ukraine war, because so far it looks as if the United States invests much more in this war than Europe does. There have been recent numbers which say that EU institutions and member states only commit half as much from the beginning of October as the United States does. And I mean, there are always, statistical questions to these figures, but in principle, it's just impossible to justify that the United States should invest more, especially when it comes to financial and economic issues, than the Europeans should. And just as a last point, I think the other question about Germany's leadership, I think there's a lot of appreciation for this role, especially in DC. There's a lot of positive feedback. But when it comes to Germany's neighbors in Warsaw and Paris, there have been different weeks so far. I mean, Warsaw is much more skeptical of Germany's leadership role. It doesn't see a German leadership role so far. So I think for Germany, it's important not only to have appreciation here in DC for the role that it plays, but also to create followers within Europe for this leadership role.
Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. First, let me say, for those who are not always following the role of Lars Klingbeil, especially in the United States, let me say, I want to congratulate you for your courage in breaking open all of these old taboos, not only in your party, particularly in your party, but I think broadly, and you've helped to unleash a broader debate in the country. The Chancellor started that, but I think you've sort of pushed it further. I don't want to get you into trouble, but I think you have, you're pushing everyone to think harder about the real implications of that. And I want to, and even what you just said now about Germany, especially on Russia, thinking now about China, it's an important debate that we have to go down the road together on. Having said that, I'm always struck that in the German debate, and I think even here, even the title, if I may say, of our topic, gives us a somewhat confusing conflation of Zeitenwende. Between Zeitenwende as an objective description of the world we're now in, we left the post-Cold War era, it is gone. We are now in what I would call an age of disruption. That's not just about China and Russia, but about a whole broad sense of forces that are disrupting our societies. That's a very different world that we have to be prepared for, and only focusing on Russia and China is only part of the question. We all are facing that. That's a descriptive, I published a book in Germany last year before all this called Zeitenwende.
Okay.
It was in German, but at that point, nobody was paying attention. But what it has become now is a description as if that is already German policy. And I don't believe that that's the case. I believe Zeitenwende is a term that the Chancellor used to describe to his countrymen and women that we're in a new world and that Germany has to adjust. But to assume that Germany has adjusted, I think, is wrong. And so we are in a process. There's so much more to do. $100 billion extra for German defense is the tip of the iceberg to what Germany really needs to be do to be serious. Germany says it's moving to 2% defense as part of GDP. The NATO debate has moved on from that to now 3%. 2% is considered the floor. 3% is going to be considered the norm, and you can see a big debate for next spring over that. So yes, it's important, but there's more to do. Germany is the framework nation for countries in Eastern Europe as part of NATO. NATO decided in Madrid at the summit to move to a new position of basically what we call deterrence by denial. That means what Chancellor Scholz says and President Biden about not 1 inch, defending every inch. That means no aggressor can even cross a line. That requires a completely radical new defense posture, including for Germany, to be able to defend forward and be forward. And yet you see already in the German debate a backstepping on that, saying that, well, our forces could stay at home and sort of be dedicated to those countries, especially Lithuania, which is the main country. I mean, if you ask the Lithuanians, they think that's an abandonment of their defense posture. So there are considerable debates about how far Germany really has gone. So I think we should approach this with some sense of perspective that we're not there yet, but I do appreciate what you've been saying.
Mr. Klingbeil, I'd like to follow up with you on one of those points. The discussions around defense spending, I mean, obviously the $100 billion fund to revitalize the Bundeswehr is a major step, but it seems like in terms of reaching NATO defense spending targets, it's going to be still a few years, in fact, maybe until 2027 or 2028. Is that a timeline that Germany sees itself being able to speed up, or how is it? And I guess, how is it responding to the, I think, inevitable criticism that will come your way, saying you said that you would spend and you're not meeting that expectation?
We started to spend,
yeah.
And so I mean it's 100 billion plus 2%, and yes, in the first years we used this 100 billion to reach the 2%, but. To be honest, it's a huge problem, and this is the question of how do we get these weapons and how they are produced. So if we order them today, they are not there tomorrow, and so we need. It's a total new installing of all this defense spending and the mechanisms of the defense industry. But everyone in Germany in the politics, in the government, but also the biggest opposition party with the Conservative Party is very clear that this is a shifting moment and that there's no way back. So, I mean, this is also, I understand that, for example, the Baltic countries look very skeptical to Germany and also the Poland, as you mentioned, and say, we said it before. And you cannot win their trust in 8 months. It's on the way. So, but the psychological shift in Germany, it's so big that, as I mentioned before, there is this war 2 hours away from us. In my district, people go to the city council and ask for new passports because they have so much fear and said maybe we have to leave Germany because of this war. And I mean, this will not happen, but it shows how people think in Germany, and it's a different situation here. For you, the war is far away, but in Germany, it's in the neighborhood. So that means people think about their own security, and that's shifting a lot of. It's shifting the willingness to spend more on security, and so this is happening. Where I'm not agree is Liana, what you said, that also the countries like the Baltic states doesn't want this leading role of Germany. I think they want this leading role. They ask for, and if it's about their own security, they want Germany to do more to protect them.
Leon, could you expand on that a little bit about what's kind of going on in the Baltics and Central and Eastern Europe?
I would agree that those countries do want a German leadership role, but they don't see it yet. And I would say, unfortunately, the curve is not sort of slowly building up in favor of Germany, but the curve is slowly going down, that more and more trust is being lost in Central and Eastern Europe. And the longer the war continues, the bigger the question becomes for those countries. If you look back at 2022, And we ask ourselves, can we trust Germany and France, for that matter? It's not only Germany, with our own security. At the moment, the answer in Central and Eastern Europe would probably be no. And that is a major problem that Germany tries to catch up with its homework on energy and security and defense policy. And it sort of depends on the perspective, how you look at it. I think here in DC, the perspective is, well, they're doing a good job, they're doing Zeitenwende, they're catching up on everything. But if the perspective is, well, the ambition should be a military leadership role, as you said, then the glass is half empty. And Zeitenwende has really become, in the imagination, something bigger than what Olaf Scholz said on February 27. It has become this idea of this big geopolitical role for Germany, the sleeping giant that finally awakens. So it's not only about fulfilling the commitments of February 27, but about being faster and moving further, and especially on China policy, where I think there is a lot of skepticism whether Germany really has learned the lessons, because it is one thing to get a statement by China against Russian nuclear threats. The other thing is to steer the German economy towards less dependency on China. And we've seen in the first half of 2022 that the German economy is heading towards more dependency on China. So the criticism ahead of Scholz's visit on the COSCO, Chinese investments in the Hamburg port, that's something which raised a lot of questions. And there is patience with Germany on Ukraine. There's less patience with Germany on China.
Dan, I'd like to ask you to pick up on that. We were sort of chatting before the event started. It seems like we could be walking into a situation, a similar situation with China as we did with Russia, where there was an overdependence on Russian energy and now perhaps an overdependence on China with regards to the German economy. Do you think that is something that is happening that we need to be worried about, and what are the steps forward?
Well, the Germans are debating their own model, and I think that's the key, I think, to the point I was making earlier about Zeitenwende. What I see is often the German debates about Ukraine or China or Russia or even the United States are really the Germans debating with themselves about themselves. And the other issues are sort of functions of this fundamental German debate that, my God, we've got to now rethink our model. And I think that's why Germany, more than any other country I can think about, is having a debate internally that's much more emotional and involved than the rest of us. The rest of us find, what are our strategies? Germany is saying, my God, we have to rethink what we even do. My colleague Constanze Stelzmüller, you probably know, she says, the German model was you outsource your security to the United States, you outsource your energy to Russia, and you outsource your economic model to China. All three of those elements are now in question. And so you see kind of the emotional element of the debate. And I think China, the U.S. thing is calm for the moment, but as you say, you don't know. The Russia debate is being tackled head on. The China debate is now coming, in which German industry, Russia for German industry was not that important, frankly, let's be honest. China, it's really important. And so that you see German industrialists now saying, now hold on, we can't possibly reconsider the terms of our engagement. That's going to be the next big debate in Germany. It's already happening. And so when people ask for German leadership in Europe, I'm always struck. I think it's leadership that they want to define. They'd love a German leadership role that is very nice with the Baltic and Polish priorities, but German leadership means something different than that. They probably don't want it. So everybody, is taking the Germany they have and say, well, you could be leaders to do the things we want you to do. But the German debate's not going to unfold like that. Germany's going to do things that people won't want it to do. And so my basic point would be, throughout that whole period of the last 7 decades, the one country that's sort of walked with Germany on this cultural, historical drama has been the United States. The U.S. has alleviated, if we're very blunt about it, the doubts other Europeans have about Germany and the self-doubts the Germans have had about themselves. And what made the last number of years so traumatic for the German colleagues was that we turned from a source of reassurance into a source of anxiety. And this specter of the U.S. returning as a source of anxiety for Germany is what prompts politicians from Germany to come over to Washington to find out after the midterms, oh my God, what's happening? And so I think we have to understand our role here in the German debate is actually quite fundamental. If we understand that there's a deeper issue going on here than simply what's our tactic tomorrow about Ukraine.
Yeah.
And this is,
Yep.
to let me add this, this is a little bit the link to the industry debate, the debate about industry politics we have here with the Inflation Reduction Act. So if a result of the American industry politics is that jobs and industry is going from Germany and Europe to United States, it's a critical situation for the transatlantic partnership. So I mean, we have to position ourselves new on the question of China. And I don't talk about decoupling, I talk about de-risking and diversification. What not means, or it does not mean that we do not any trade with China, but it means that we have to be prepared if they are attacking Taiwan. Then we have to cut off everything like we did with Russia in these days. And it also means that we need to define areas of the economy where we not allow China to get in. Last week there was a decision in the German government to leave the Chinese out of this a chip producer in Dortmund, and I think this was a very right decision, and it's also a symbolic decision to say we don't let you in. But if we have a fight with China on economic question and we have a critical situation with United States on the other hand, so then maybe we lose support in the German population. And this is a point where we have to find a transatlantic solution to have this good cooperation, but I see this also as a difficult point in the transatlantic agenda.
Perhaps just to quickly add to that, I mean, I think the question of decoupling is probably not the real priority here. I mean, it's often used a little bit as a straw man. Germany doesn't want to decouple, whereas I think what DC seems to be concerned about is the fact that companies like Volkswagen rely on the Chinese market to an extent which makes it impossible to quickly de-risk investments, and that we see more and more investments in the last month into China. And I think that is sort of a different perspective than the United States saying to Germany, you have to cut your relations with China. And on another point, I think it's also interesting, perhaps we should also mention that there are also dynamics within Berlin, within the coalition government on China, in internal debates, and the chip fabric that you mentioned, but also the investment in the Hamburg port. It also seems that this is something where we have differences within the German government coalition, with the Greens being more forward-leaning, both on Ukraine support and on countering Chinese influence, reducing Germany's independence on Chinese influence. So I think especially if we talk about the Social Democratic Party, I think that's something where the Social Democratic Party in some aspects can catch up with its coalition partners.
Yeah, but the question of the chip, the decision of the chip fabrik in Dortmund was a common decision in the government, and yeah, there were some debates about the question of the port, but at the end, the government is writing this new China strategy, a resilience strategy, and this will be a common strategy of the government. And I think it's good that the debate is starting right now, and we have to find a common strategy, and it will be there till the end of the year. But Olaf Scholz is very clear that we need this de-risking with China. So the question is, do you think that the port is a critical infrastructure and all of this? So there were some debates about that in Germany, but in the question, should we de-risk from China and should we have this diversification? The government is totally clear on this question. And yes, there's another dynamic after the start of the war in Ukraine, but it's there. And so the decision is there. 2 years before, if we had the same situation, to be honest, nobody in Germany would be interested in a China strategy. There would be no public debate about all these questions. So that shows that we have another public situation if there's a debate about this question. I do not know how many decisions we had in the last years about something similar like the port decision. I do not know, but it was under the radar, so nobody was talking about that. And now we have this debate, and I think it's good that there is a strategic debate about that.
decoupling is a term that's easy to say, but it I think confuses things again, because it's more what you're saying. What I would say, it's about debate. We're debating how to redefine the terms of our interdependence with China. It's not decoupling. It is pulling back in some areas, but not in some others. It's trying to find a different type of balance, and that's quite different. My point about the Zeitenwende, the way I would describe it, like objective description of the world we're now facing, is that this disruption is occurring through all the flows that connect our societies. You can see Putin is weaponizing, refugees, food, people, energy, cyber, you name it. But the Chinese have also been manipulating lots of the flows and also advancing a new type of agenda through the Belt and Road and other types of connectivity policies that sort of ensconce Chinese standards. And that's where the port becomes part of a new kind of debate, because it's connecting Germany in different ways. Germany, probably most because of the old model, is completely dependent on those flows. And so I would hope any new Zeitenwende strategy will take care of the security of the flows that Germany's connected to, not just about the territorial notion of security. And I see some glimmers of it, but I don't see it really, developing yet. And that's why I think it'll take some time.
We have some questions from the audience, so I want to be sure to turn to those so that, let's see, we have some time. There's a question from an online attendee, Hannah Tuckett, that says, how do you think that Zeitenwende will impact Germany's politico-military relationship with NATO? Do you think Germany will take a larger leading role within the alliance, and does it have the capacity to do so? I think we've already touched on the capacity part, but I do think this, whether or not it will take a larger leading role in the alliance, is something that we're still discussing. Mr. Klingbeil, what do you think about that?
I think that Germany's role in NATO was always very clear, that it was Trump and Macron who questions NATO. So I think with the Biden administration, there's no questioning of NATO, and also Macron is on another way. So, so Germany never questioned NATO, but if we take more responsibility, I would say with this package of 100 billion, it's a clear signal towards NATO that we take more responsibility.
Please hop in.
Just again, I think the debate now is the Zeitenwende is touted again as a transformation, but it's still about checkbook diplomacy. That's an old tactic, the old German model. If you're in a jam, spend more money on it. And spending more isn't the same as spending well. And so spending 100 billion doesn't tell you where you actually want to go. And that's where it connects to the NATO debate, because the broader NATO debate is about how to increase European capabilities to defend itself, to take care of challenges to its south, which many other NATO allies are really concerned about, and how to sort of alleviate the pressure on the United States that is dealing with issues in the Indo-Pacific as well as the North Atlantic. So I and others have said, it would be helpful if we realize this will take a decade, and let's set ourselves two goals, just goals, to get from here to there in 1 decade with the money but the capabilities. One is Europe should be able to provide half the capability to deter Russia. It doesn't do that right now, not even half. And secondly, Europe should be the first responder to crises that happen all along its southern periphery. Often European forces can't even get to these crisis spots without getting in US airplanes. They don't even know that they don't have the logistics, they don't have the communication, they don't have so much of the infrastructure simply to patrol their neighborhood. And the US is not inclined to always do that, but it does it. But we're strapped now with Indo-Pacific. So if Europe could achieve those two goals in 10 years, ambitious but realistic, I think it would keep the US commitment to Europe while still maintaining its efforts in the Indo-Pacific. It would advance a more strategic responsibility on the part of the Europeans, and it would actually deal with these two fronts that you have to deal with. So my plea is let's talk about where the money should be invested to do what, not just how much money you're spending.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, from a realistic perspective, one has to ask the question whether it's going to be Germany that plays this role or whether it's going to be Poland. I mean, I think we always underestimate how important Poland has become strategically for the region, how important Poland has become for the United States, how sort of there's new weight on the whole Nordic, Central, and Eastern European security and defense policy, and we do see that Poland is investing a lot more than Germany does in its defense spending. Obviously, there's also different threat perception, but that, to bring this together, Poland, which is investing more, looking towards the United States instead of looking towards Germany, at the same time, France with very different priorities, and we saw that in the European Shield Initiative, where Germany tried to go ahead with other member states, but France and Poland did not follow on these initiatives. So I think these two crucial relationships between Germany and Poland, Germany and France, and we all love the Weimar Triangle, the German, Polish, French relationship, which unfortunately never sort of really got to the heights that we hoped it will go to at some point. I think these two relationships are crucial for Europe, and at the moment I see these two relationships rather in trouble than in good shape of following Germany in a leadership role.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, with Poland, to be honest, we have a difficult situation also because of the election campaign there. I mean, I went to Poland, and Kaczynski was giving a speech a few days before I went there and said this 100 billion we spent in military, are they really against Russia or they're against Poland again? So, I mean, to me, it seems sometimes we could not do something right. So I think it's a little bit longer way than one decision to build this new trust, and but it's difficult with the leading party also in Poland. If sometimes it seems to me that Germany is one of the main topics in the internal election campaigns we have in Poland. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for us. But what we do in Germany, I think it's the right way, and it will build trust at the end. But can I ask also a question about the Indo-Pacific question? Because to me it seems that it's not so important who will win the next election for the White House. The shift will be from a Democratic or Republican president towards Indo-Pacific region. So I mean, if we talk about Germany and Europe and NATO, I think it must be in our interest to have a strong European pillar in the NATO, and that means we have to take our responsibility for ourselves, but to do that in NATO. But to me, sometimes it seems that it's clear here, bipartisan, that that the shift from U.S. security policy will be towards Indo-Pacific region.
Well, again, in terms, I mean, the national security strategy the administration just released basically says that, in terms of China being the most consequential geopolitical challenge. But Russia is engaged in a major land war in Europe at the moment, and basically you can bet the U.S. is going to stay focused on that. We are Atlantic and Pacific. We do not have the luxury of pivoting. We will do both. It's just whether we'll do both well with allies or whether we'll get caught up. So we would hope that security in Europe could be managed by the Europeans. This is what Donald Trump tapped into when he said, why would 500 million Europeans still be dependent on 330 million Americans for their security? That's a question that Europe doesn't answer very well. And most Americans who don't think about these things sort of say, yeah, why is that? So I think that's the test in terms of, really the Zeitenwende in defense, is answering that question well. But the U.S. is going to remain engaged. We've actually increased our budgets for Europe, not decreased. And we did it before the renewed invasion in Ukraine, both under a Trump administration and a Biden administration. The Republicans in Congress are strong on NATO. They rebuffed Donald Trump all the time. So it's not an either-or choice for the United States. We have to actually do both of these. We could do it better if we had a sense that our European allies were doing more. That's the only point. That's where we agree, I think. I think our test is, how do you define more? More what? I gave you two goals, which I think are realistic, but I think that's where we should have our debate.
Thank you. There's a couple questions on here that I might combine into one. They come down to EU defense integration. So how do you see I'll start with you, Chairman Klingbeil, and then Dan and Liana, you can both comment if you'd like. How do you see the Zeitenwende impacting EU defense integration, either on the level of establishing a common defense force or creating a common defense procurement market? And there are other questions here that talk about Germany and France agreeing on a future combat aircraft. There's one here about, jointly procuring weapons and whether or not these legislative proposals are feasible. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what this means for a more integrated EU defense market, if anything.
So in my opinion, this has to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end, we need a European army, but this is it's a long way because of the difficult situation we have in different countries about the question who's legitimizing an army to go somewhere. But we have a lot of steps between that. For example, we have German-France cooperation, German-Netherlands. So we need more of this bilateral, trilateral cooperations, and these are all little steps to a complete European integration. And the second point you mentioned was the was it Beschaffung, procurement?
Procurement, like joint procurement.
I'm in Defense Committee now for 12 years, and this is really a situation that is not acceptable anymore. That every European country is doing its own solution, and to be honest, sometimes we need to take material from the United States or from Israel, for example, if they already have something. So in Germany, we try to find a perfect solution. In Europe, we try to find a perfect solution. It takes 20 years, 30 years, and this is always a problem. And we need the material now. So that means if there's a good solution in the United States or in Israel, for example, we should buy that. As Social Democrats, sometimes it's difficult because then you have the unions, the workers' unions coming and say, we need to produce it here. And there's also a link to this industry politics question. So if America is doing industry politics for their own, there will be, like you had this in the last week in France when they talk about trade war, then it's difficult to buy things here or in Israel because there will be an ongoing debate in Europe to buy our own things. But we need to be very quick. We need to see the integrated market and this defense spending, and we need a common European market, and this is where the government should put forward more than it's doing right now.
Yeah.
And I think, there's an even larger question to that. There's obviously the goal, which would be nice if the EU cooperates more together on defense production, but we do have this major war in Europe. So the big question, I think, for the European Union and for NATO is how do we ramp up our industrial defense production to help Ukraine and to continue to deliver weapons to Ukraine, because depending on how long the war continues, Ukraine will need more and more Western weapons, and we are running out of those stocks. And sort of to have a shift for Ukraine, not this mix and match approach that we had so far with Rammstein, bringing everyone together, whatever they still have in their stockpiles, but to change to a mode of structural support for Ukraine and an industrial base that is actually able to produce for a major land war is really the ambition that we probably should have there.
Yeah. There's just a few minutes left, but I wanted to close on, we've talked about some pretty specific items. I wanted to sort of bring it back to a 30,000-foot view to close us off. The midterm elections in the US just happened. The Republicans didn't see the red wave that they were expecting, which means I think a lot of people are sort of breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief because Germany was the focus of a lot of Republican ire during the Trump administration, and it's been Biden's focus to repair that relationship along with the broader relationship with Europe, of course. So Biden has 2 years left in his first term. With a majority in the Senate, not a majority in the House, although by a slim margin. Where do you think the US and Germany should focus on really strengthening the relationship over the next couple of years while Biden is still in office, sort of not knowing what comes after that? Dan, I might start with you and then Liana and then close with you, Chairman Klingbeil.
I think one result of the midterms is that the Republicans will now start to fight each other.
Yeah.
That's what you're about to see. It not only in terms of preparation for the presidential campaign, but it's going to spill over into the House of Representatives itself. You know, the symbol of the Republican Party is the elephant. But John Boehner, the former House Speaker, said it was always like getting 218 frogs into a wheelbarrow. So whether the Republicans will be elephants or frogs, I think will be a test of their ability to govern one house, or whether they will spend all their time with themselves, that the president has some leeway. I think where there is pressure, two areas of pressure for Germany and Europe will be, one is on Ukraine, because I think the Republican focus will start to become, yes, support for lethal aid, no question, but when it comes to other kinds of support, the Europeans should do more. And you'll see building pressure, and frankly, many Democrats think the same. So I think you're going to see building pressure on Europe to take on more of the overall burden. And you mentioned in your talk earlier about reconstruction. I don't think there's any expectation in the United States that the U.S. would lead on that. Europe, it's Europe. So I think that's coming. And how we manage that expectation together will be important. The other is on China, where it's a different dynamic, where there, as you said, there's bipartisan view on China. The competition now is who's tougher on China here, and what tools will you use to, beat everyone up. And I think that'll interact badly with the German debate as you go forward. So I think I have sensed a change in the European debate about China that's getting to more of understanding as a systemic rival what Europe has to do. But I don't think Germany's in the lead on that debate. And I'm not sure that the Europeans will go as far as the U.S. administration has in a number of areas recently in terms of cutting off all sorts of important flows of technology and so on. So I think that's where we have to manage that. My point about it is, thankfully, I think we have these normal irritants. You mentioned the IRA as well. But they're happening right now in the context of unity, not division. Before it was bad issues, bad karma. Now the atmosphere is somewhat different. It's a problem-solving type of atmosphere. Yes, we still have those problems, but let's actually work on them. So that's the opportunity, I think, for the next 2 years.
Thank you.
And I think if one looks at the outcome of the midterm elections in a very optimistic view, which one can try to do, it does show that we do have a majority of Americans who prefer central voices, who don't want those extremist politicians to get elected and to become the defining voices in US politics. And I definitely think this is something for Europeans and for Germans to cling on and to say, well, all these nightmare scenarios about it's almost inevitable that 2024 will lead to a return of Donald Trump and so on, all these nightmare scenarios don't have to become true. And there's always a saying, Americans will try all different options, you can say it, before they finally choose the right option. But I do think we see an opportunity here to redefine the picture of the United States, that it is still able to lead as a Western power based on values, and that there's sort of no reason for Europeans to despair when it comes to the leadership role of the United States, but instead to make everything possible that we don't have 2 years of divisions about IRA and so on, but 2 years where we get closer together, especially on security in Europe, and also on the question, just to add on the reconstruction efforts, on the question of European security guarantees. What kind of security guarantees will Ukraine receive if this war comes to a standstill at some point? And I do think there have been good proposals made by the Jermak Rasmussen report, but I do think that's another area where Germany could assume a leading role in the discussion about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Thank you.
So if I think about the transatlantic agenda, and I see 3 points, like you mentioned before. The first one is Ukraine, and the question how the war is ending. I see that Biden and Scholz are working very close together. That's important for both sides. But the question how this war could end, what's happening then, and then the area of reconstruction, where I know that we have to take a lot of responsibility. Second point is China, strategic dialogue about China, and it's starting now. And it's good that it started. And it's also good to see that, as I mentioned before, that the talks between Biden and Xi go in the same direction like the talks of Scholz and Xi. And then the third point for me is the question of trade. And this has also a link to security policy. I mean, I recognize here in Washington that TTIP is more that than I expected, but to identify which areas we could see for trade talks and all these questions, I think this is also important for the transatlantic link and for the cooperation between Germany and the United States and Europe and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you for the fascinating discussion, and thank you for seeing us here at the Atlantic Council, Chairman Klingbeil. Dr. Fix, Dr. Hamilton, thank you for your comments as well. This has been a fascinating conversation. It's given us a lot to think about and a lot to take with us. And to our audience tuning in on Zoom, on Twitter, on YouTube, thank you for your participation as well. We look forward to seeing you here at the Atlantic Council next time. Thanks.